In this video, we'll discuss how friction is work in our daily life. So first of all, take an example. Suppose this is a marble. This is a marble. If I roll this marble through a table, suppose this is the table. After some time rolling on the table, the marble will be at rest. So this is the point A and this is the point B. We enforce a force to this marble and try to make this marble to move, but after some time t-second, this marble will be at the position B and rest position. So why this marble is in the rest position, or why this marble is stopped? So there is a force that tries to reduce the relative motion of this marble, so that after some time t-second, this marble is in a rest position or it is stopped. So this external force is known as friction. This external force is known as friction. So what friction means? Friction is a force which opposes the relative sliding motion of two surfaces in contact with one another. Here, the surface of the marble and the surface of the table is in the contact with one another. There are some friction in this table, and this friction opposes the relative sliding motion of this marble. So when this relative motion is reduced, that's why after some time the marble is at position B in rest position, or we can say that the marble is stopped. So this is the main concept of friction, and we can say that friction is necessary to our daily life. So why it is necessary? Why it is necessary? Because when we walk through a road, what happened? We can walk properly, nothing, we don't slide, we don't get we don't fall on this road, because the friction is high on the road. Friction is high on the road. So what happened when we walk through a slippery road? When we walk through a slippery road, so what happened? When we walk through a slippery road, the friction of the slippery road is less, so we cannot balance ourselves in the slippery road. Because the friction is less, that's why the relative motion doesn't reduces, it increases when we walk through the road. So this disbalance our momentum and our balance. So that's why friction is necessary in our daily life, but sometimes it also creates some problem. When another example of the evilness of the friction. So why it is evil? When there is a lot of friction in the bearing of a cycle, then the bearing will be reduces the day by day. There will be some losses of iron on this bearing because of the friction, because the friction is higher on this bearing of a cycle. That's why sometimes it is evil, in the friction is act as an evil. So that's why friction is called a necessary evil. So friction is called a necessary evil. So this is the first of main concept of friction. So there are two kinds of friction. One is static friction. There are two kinds of friction. One is static friction and one is kinetic friction. There is two kinds of friction. One is static and another is kinetic. So what is static friction? Static friction says that when an object doesn't slide along a surface on which it rests, even though a force is exerted to make it slide, then the contact surface is called static friction. So let us take an example. So the example is, suppose this is a table and we put an object on that table. In this case, this is the center of mass. We denote the center of mass as P. So the weight of this object, the weight of this object is acting in the downwards direction. And according to Newton's third law, the table also exerts an equal reaction force R along the center of the mass P opposite to W. Since these two forces act along the same straight line, so the block will be at static position. So the box is static. Now, if a force F is applied on the block parallel to the surface of the table, and if the block doesn't move, then we understand that an equal but opposite force acts on the block. So if I force to move this block and the block doesn't move, then we can say an opposite force, like we represent this opposite force as F of L, is act on the opposite direction of this force F, or we can say that in the Q direction. So this opposite force is known as static friction. This opposite force is known as static friction. So now there is a term, this is known as limiting static friction. Limiting static friction. So what is this limiting static friction means? Now if we increases the force F slowly, then at a particular magnitude of force, the block tends to move. So after some time, if I try to increase the speed or increase the force of this F, after some time, this block will be moved. So the maximum value of the static friction is called the limiting static friction. So what is the limiting static friction means? The maximum value of the static friction. The maximum value of the static friction. So the maximum static friction, or the maximum value of the static friction, is known as the limiting static friction. So that means the maximum value of the static friction at that point, so when F equals to FFL, then the block will not move. When F is less than F of L, the block will not move. But when F is greater than F of L, then the block will be moved, where we enforce the force. So the minimum, so this minimum force is not the maximum value of the static friction is known as limiting static friction. There is another term which is known as let me clear this thing. There is another term which is known as coefficient of static friction. Coefficient of static friction. So what is coefficient of static friction? It says when two objects are in contact with each other. So this is one object table and this is the block. The ratio of limiting static force, the ratio, so the ratio means the ratio of limiting static force. So this is the limiting static force, and the normal reaction force. So this is the reaction force R. The normal reaction force R is called the coefficient of the static force, and we represent this coefficient of the static force as mu, and mu of S. Mu of S. So mu of S means the limiting static force divided by the normal reaction force. This is known as coefficient of static friction. Now we will see how static friction works on an inclined plane. Suppose an object AB is at rest on the inclined plane. So this is the inclined plane AB, and object is rest on this inclined plane. The inclined plane make an angle with theta with the horizontal axis, or the horizontal line, or the horizontal plane. So this is make an angle of theta with the horizontal plane. Now if the mass of this, or the uh, weight of this block is W, the W is acting at the downwards direction, and the component of this W at horizontal direction is, or we can say, is, as this is a theta, this will also be theta. So this component will be known as W cos theta according to the vector components law, and this horizontal direction or the vertical direction will have W sine of theta, and there will be a reacted force according to the Newton's third law, which will be acting with the opposite of W cos theta. So this is the R. So we can say that W cos of theta equals to minus of R according to the Newton's third law. And as we say that this block is at rest in this plane AB, then there will be an static friction which is denoted as F, and F will be equals to W of sine of theta, and also opposite to each other. So this is the case of how static friction works on an inclined plane. So this whole scenario is needed when we have to solve mathematical problem. In the mathematical problem case, this scenario and these equations are very important. So this is all about static friction. Now we will discuss what is kinetic friction. The friction that is generated when a body moves over another body, the two bodies being in contact with each other, is called kinetic or sliding friction. The examples are always in our daily life, like a car moving on the road. The object car and the object road are is contact with one another, and they are the two bodies being contact with one another, and the friction is generated when body moves over another body, and the car is moving over the road. So this is an example of kinetic friction. For kinetic friction, we have to remember one thing. This point is kinetic friction is less than the limiting friction. Limiting friction. So we have to understand this thing is kinetic friction is less than limiting friction. So the limiting friction is always greater than the kinetic friction. There are some laws of kinetic friction. The first one is laws. The first law is kinetic friction always acts against the motion of objects. So it acts against the motion of object. The motion of object. The second point is kinetic friction is proportional to the normal reaction. So the kinetic friction is proportional to the normal reaction. Normal reaction. The third one is kinetic friction does not depend on the area of the contact of the surface. So it doesn't depend on the area of contact of the surfaces. And the fourth law is kinetic friction is independent of relative velocity of the surfaces. So it is independent. The kinetic friction is independent. This is the fourth law followed for the kinetic friction. So now one more point we have to discuss is the coefficient of kinetic friction. Coefficient of kinetic friction. So what is the coefficient of kinetic friction means? The ratio of kinetic friction and normal friction is called the coefficient of kinetic friction. So it is denoted by mu of k. So it is the ratio of kinetic friction divided by the normal reaction. This ratio is known as coefficient of kinetic friction. There are two more kinds of friction. One is known as rolling frictions. One is known as rolling friction. So what is rolling friction means? Rolling friction means if when one body rolls over the surface of another body, then the friction which is generated is called rolling frictions. The rolling friction is generated when like football, marble, lawn roller, etc. move over the ground. So this is an example of rolling friction. And another friction is fluid friction. Fluid friction. So what is fluid friction? If a body remains stationary or any moving liquid or gaseous substance, or if any body moves over a liquid or gaseous substance, then the friction that is generated is called fluid friction. This type of friction is generated when liquid or gaseous substances moves over a fixed surface. So like an example, if we take an example like friction between a boat and water, while boat moves over the surface of the water, it is an example of fluid friction. So we discuss the different kinds of friction and how friction is necessary in our daily life. That's all for today's video. We'll discuss some mathematical problem in our next video. Thank you.